Then, and our next speaker is going to be Panos Papageorgiou from the International College of Portsmouth, and he's going to talk about preserving archaeological virtual reconstructions, which I think may have been part of your doctoral thesis, wasn't it, Panos?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So hot off the research press here. So.
Yeah. not so fresh, but yeah, 2-3 years old.
That's. I can see your author view at the moment.
You can hear
that's
me?
it. Yeah,
Great.
see your presentations. Fab.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Panos, and I'm an early career researcher, currently teaching at the International College Portsmouth. Today, I'm going to present to you some of the major outcomes of my PhD thesis. Essentially, they are two streamlined processes, which when put together, they constitute distinct parts of a framework, which I would like to call PVA. The acronym stands for Preserving Virtual Archaeology. And similarly to the adhesive, it helps glue together the siloed processes of creating archaeological virtual reconstructions and preserving their long-term accessibility. For my doctoral research, I received the Research and Innovation Award at the 2022 International Conference on Digital Preservation in Glasgow. Here's what I'm going to discuss for the next 20 minutes. Firstly, I will briefly define what comprises an archaeological research project and introduce the concept of chain of custody for archaeological virtual reconstruction. Then the conversation will shift to the 4 key stages during the data lifecycle where the different actors could intervene and take a preservation snapshot of the data to be archived. Afterwards, the focus will steer more towards emulation as a preservation strategy for virtual reconstructions, along with one of the 3 rendering case studies that were part of my research program. In the end, I'm going to show you how the results of rendering case studies allowed for the recommendation of an evaluation checklist for archaeological virtual reconstructions. So as I mentioned, 2 streamlined processes. So it's actually the first one, the 2 first ones are for creating virtual reconstructions, and the next 2 are for preserving virtual reconstructions. Put them together, we'll see the framework at the end. So here you saw the process and agents involved in the production and consumption of a virtual reconstruction. So usually an archaeological research project consists of a documentary archive, which includes CAD files, databases, spreadsheets, 3D data, etc., and a material or finds archive, which composes of artifacts, building materials, environmental remains, and so on. All these roles together, the archaeologists, the 3D creatives or 3D specialists, computer modelers, whatever you want to call them, plus the future researcher, historian, and the public, of course, members of the public, they form the interlinked chain of custody. And the data during the process, they feed into the next step. So from the archaeologists, we have the original and intermediate data. The original could be laser scan point clouds. The intermediate data could be stratigraphic data generated by archaeologists, used by the 3D specialists. The final artifact generated by 3D creatives could be the virtual reconstruction paradata and development files. And the final visualizations, for example, film or fly-through or virtual reconstruction, also generated by the 3D creatives used by the public and future researchers. This is the second streamlined process, again, for creating virtual reconstructions. Here you see exactly the same continuum as before, but with 2 added points, the preservation intervention points, the PIPs there. So because data needs to be preserved at different stages during its life cycle, there are 4 key stages. Data capture is number 1. Number 2 is after processing. Number 3 is post-processing and analysis. And number 4 is creation of dissemination outputs. All these during the data life cycle the data producer could intervene and take a preservation snapshot of the data to be archived. You see the first peep is between the archaeologist and the 3D creative, so you go back to original and intermediate data, and when they are handed over to the 3D creatives. And the last one for the final artifact and the final visualization, we have the post-processing and analysis and creation of dissemination outputs that will be handed over to the future researchers. Streamline process number 3. Now we're going into preserving virtual reconstructions. I don't know how, if you can see it clearly, it's a screenshot when I was doing the rendering tests. So my rendering, the rendering case study I'm going to show you is about a monument, archaeological monument, political hall actually in Turkey. There are no traces anymore. You cannot find it anywhere. It was a work of the now defunct King's Visualization Lab. They did the virtual reconstruction back in 2001. And I tested the BWFLA emulation framework created by the University of Freiburg in Germany. And in its upgraded version called Emil. These guys nowadays, they've taken it further to the easy emulation framework, for those of you who've heard it. So emulation platforms are frameworks that host third-party emulators, for example, Kimu KVM, facilitating the automated selection of optimal view paths for specific objects. While the BWFLA cloud-based emulation platform has previously been tested for interactive artworks and other types of data, such as textual and financial, my thesis offered an evaluation of the BWFLA and the Emil, its upgraded version, cloud-based emulation frameworks for the first time against archaeological virtual reconstructions. The first step was to install 3ds Max 7. This is here on the left. Sorry, there on the left is the emulator, Kimu KVM, in case you cannot see it. And on the right, it says 3ds Max 7, 32-bit is the version that was installed. Using the first step was to install 3ds Max 7, 32-bit using Kimu KVM on Windows XP 32-bit. Now the view path, before I talk about this challenge I had, the view path looked like the following. So we have Kimu KVM, the emulator, 3ds Max 7 32-bit, the rendering application, and then we inject the max file, was a 3ds Max file from disk, and that completes the ingest process. Nevertheless, once inside the emulated environment, you can see Windows XP, it was discovered that the injection was not successful. That was because the Windows XP installation was not optimized. I'm talking about a few years ago. And the virtual machine was hosted on a rather weak CPU cluster. Another technical issue was the lack of sufficient virtual memory for rendering the largest of the 3 virtual reconstructions that they give me access to. That was 44.6 megabytes. At least 1 gigabyte of RAM is required for this kind of process, while originally only 128 megabytes were available within the virtual CPU of Kimu KVM. The testing platform used was a temporary installation for research purposes only of the German version of Windows XP with 3ds Max 7 installed and a functional disk attachment. And here you see the message I was getting, low virtual memory in Windows XP. That's in German. I don't speak German, but I found out what it meant. So the fourth streamline process and the last one before the framework, it's again for preserving virtual reconstructions. So now you inject the max file from disk. We start the ingest process. So the process followed in arriving at extraction of the rendered max file from the emulated environment was the following. Firstly, the max file was ingested into the emulated environment. Here you see the 3D scene file uploaded from a local computer. I was all on the cloud, but uploaded from my local computer within the Windows XP, the emulated Windows XP. So I could double click and start the application. Secondly, the max file was rendered via QEMU KVM on the computer platform for which it was originally designed. That means Windows XP. So we start rendering the scene, and then I configure the rendering options. And here you can see rendering in progress. That was, by the way, the final visualization. It was a video fly-through. Very kind of poor graphics compared to nowadays. We're talking about 2001 final visualization. Then, as we could not be in a position to know exactly when Windows synchronizes the file operations, that's all quite technical, but it's part of the process. It would be better to shut down the virtual machine, literally Windows XP. I can even hear the sound when I turn it off, and then stop and download. So click and stop, click stop and proceed to export files. This is how it looks when the QEMU KVM was shut down. Just a message saying remote emulator has been stopped. And then fourthly and lastly, all data from disk E are available as a zip file ready to download. So I have to talk about the outcome of the rendering case study. This is 1 out of 3, but that led to an emulation framework for virtual reconstruction and something more tangible out of it. I had other contributions to knowledge as well as part of my thesis. Was this evaluation criteria. Again, this is kind of, it's not exactly the table. I have something, I mean, it's some of the criteria that are unchanged. So I didn't add them here. Those are the ones, the top ones are the ones redefined in dark blue, redefined for archaeology, for the archaeology domain. And the last ones are the new ones I came up with. So the outcome of the rendering case studies, as you can expect, was very positive. When rendered outside the emulated environment, the 3D scene files were identical to the extracted objects from the EMIL emulation framework. Through the rendering case studies, it was demonstrated that cloud-based emulation could be employed as part of an effective preservation strategy, talking about access and export for obsolete virtual reconstructions from the archaeology domain. When assessing a complex digital object for preservation, though, a framework is required to determine if the target is complete enough for preservation. For example, does its data offset the financial cost of preservation? Previous evaluations of emulation frameworks for obsolete CD-ROM artworks and computer games suggested checklists of items to be considered when preserving complex digital objects. However, my thesis redefined some of those categories for archaeological virtual reconstructions based on the non-supported aspects of the selected obsolete archaeological virtual reconstructions. Thus, in order to effectively preserve virtual reconstructions, the prior synthesized evaluation checklists should be redefined and augmented with additional categories. Those are the 3 additional categories. So going back to chain of custody, I'm reading here directly for you in case you cannot see it. The chain of custody of the data should start in the ground, I mean back to the archaeologist. Every subsequent creative decision needs to be recorded as they change the original data into interpretation. Preservation metadata. The original data should be maintained alongside full documentation of the creative design process. Ideally, all this information included in the 3D files themselves. And the virtual reconstruction paradata, which is the research process, information about the process the creative design process for a virtual reconstruction. In order to be valid, both its archaeological paradata, the information about the archaeological process, and virtual reconstruction paradata needs to be associated. So now if you're asking what's the point of this framework, the framework provides a practical starting point for memory institutions to make decisions about the long-term preservation of the archaeological virtual reconstruction submitted to their collections. Each archaeological virtual reconstruction does not have to address all the proposed criteria to be archived, but the framework provides an understanding of what will be preserved and perhaps an opportunity at ingestion to check with the depositor whether any additional missing metadata or ancillary files are available. It also hints at which points during the data lifecycle the data producer could intervene and take a preservation snapshot of the data to be archived. I know there's still some work to do in order to be called a standard. I'm currently working on it, especially focusing on the preservation intervention points. We know the key stages, the 4 key stages. I want to delve deeper into actually define them for archaeology, how it would look like. I'm talking about even formats of the file. So if any of you have any idea, please do contact me. Here's my email and the DOI of my doctoral thesis if you want to read further. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Panos. Thank you. Can I just ask everyone to show their appreciation with the usual virtual applause? I say I love that light bulb slide. That's great. But before I get distracted with that, does anybody have any questions in response to what Panos has said? I know that perhaps there's something about digital preservation that seems to attract archaeologists, and I know there's a few of them on this call. And in fact, Jenny, my colleague at the DPC, is saying she really likes to focus on documentation, metadata, paradata, and the chain of custody starts in the ground.
Yes.
So Jenny, did you want to elaborate on that? Yeah.
Not on that, but I did have another question.
Okay.
Thanks, Panos, for your presentation. You just briefly touched at the end on this idea of creating a standard. I just wondered if you want to say anything more about that, because that was quite interesting to me.
I mean, that was the reason. Should I stop sharing, by the way, or it's okay to leave the slide?
That's okay. Let's leave it up. Yeah, that's fine.
No, my idea and my aim, or my hope, my wish, if you like, is to see it turning into like a standard, a best practice, something like, maybe I'm too optimistic here, but something like the guides to good practice from Archaeology Data Service. But I know that's what I'm saying. Like it was a limited sample size when I was doing my doctoral research. I know there are limitations. I checked, and because I did the rendering case studies, I know my research is generalizable up to a certain point. But yeah, I need to do more work to cover more aspects of the framework in order to be called like a standard. So maybe you can implement it as it is, take parts of it because it's tested, but maybe you can see easily that something's missing here, something missing there. So that's now it's not a complete standard. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's good to know what you're going to be up to next.
Yeah.
Thanks, Panos.
Thank you.
And Andy, who's not an archaeologist, but is a DPC colleague, again, has said, are there any potential longer-term stable formats for these virtual reconstructions? Or is it a wild mess of proprietary tools that change over time?
That's the problem. That's exactly the problem, the proprietary formats. Again, because it's only 20 minutes, I came up with kind of part of the thesis was also recommendation of open formats where it's possible. Of course, it's not always possible when we're talking about archaeology. And I think it was OBJ was one. I can remember it was open format. But of course, you're missing a lot of properties. You're missing a lot of features when we transfer for a proprietary to an open source format. So I don't have exactly like the answer that if you go open source, you're going to resolve all your issues. But yeah, I mean, steps of the process, for example, the creative design process, if it can, all of this can be saved, the 3D builds, the development files, if they can be built in open format for later reuse, that would be the ideal case.
So if I've understood that right, the issue is really with the open source tools. If they were better, then...
No, the open tool. Yes, I mean technically, yeah, that's another answer. I mean, there is the 3D PDF, for example, that allows you to rotate a virtual reconstruction in there and play a little bit with it, but does not allow you to have all the features that 3D Studio Max or AutoCAD allows you to have. So something you win, something you lose, and of course you don't want to lose anything actually. So yeah, either a better version of open source format, or open as possible, or wherever is possible, and then try with strategies similar to like emulation actually, to have access for the next 20, 30 years from now to these dynamic objects.
And have you had much engagement with people in other sectors? I think you mentioned like 3D art. I mean, obviously, and you're mentioning AutoCAD there. I can think of engineering, buildings. There must be lots of people that are facing a similar challenge.
I was working closer to architects and computer game designers when I was doing the research. I worked mostly closer with archaeologists. But what I gather from them, it all comes down to the unique personality. I don't know if I included actually in my thesis, but I've said somewhere that it's kind of a rare breed. So they either don't have access to their data, they hold really tight to their data. It has to do with the country where the archaeology, the excavation is conducted, with monetary factors as well. And yeah, because I was also focused when I do the generalization, I can see when I'm talking about generalization of my research, I can see that architects could benefit from a similar framework. As I said, the checklist is synthesized mostly from digital art. I took and redefined the criteria from digital art and computer games. And the whole, probably a lot of you know that the whole emulation story started from computer game hobbyists.
Yeah.